I want to thank everyone for showing up today. December Zoom is not always easy to do, but we're glad to have you here. My name is Kathleen Fairfax. I'm the Vice Provost for International Affairs at Colorado State. And today we have with us Ambassador Michael McFaul. And I would like to do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll turn it right over to the ambassador to give us some of his thoughts. So Ambassador McFaul served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council at the White House. And then he was U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. Since he left the ambassadorial service, he's kept very busy. Ambassador McFaul is currently at Stanford University, serving as the Director and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute, also at Stanford University. He's also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. He's a frequent contributor to MSNBC as well. He has authored several books, most recently the New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace. So I want to welcome Ambassador McFaul. We are very interested in hearing what you have to say. And just a note to the audience, you can submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function in the Zoom room, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. So welcome, Ambassador McFaul, and thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks. I love Colorado. I just sent a Ukrainian friend of mine to your beautiful state. Even though he's not supposed to travel, he is anyway, because he's only here for a little bit. And I said, if you had a little bit of time to go to somewhere beautiful, you should go to Montana first. That's where I'm from. But that was too far away, so he's in your state right now. And I look forward to getting back someday. I'm going to share my screen now, I hope. If the Zoom gods will allow us. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathleen, for confirming. I once spoke for like 12 minutes and nobody could hear me or see my slides once on Zoom. So thank you for weighing in.
We're all good.
So I am working on a new book project, and hopefully when it's out, I can come see you in person. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, about great power competition in the 21st century. It builds on, obviously, some work I've done before, both in the government and as a professor, but now I'm looking at a wider set of issues, and particularly the triangular relationship between the United States, China, and Russia. I think it's striking that if you look at the news over the last 4 or 5 years, it's really incredible how quickly this idea of a new Cold War has caught on in both of these bilateral relationships. It started first with Russia, and here's just a few things that I posted to remind you. The former prime minister talking about a new Cold War when he was speaking at the Munich Security Council. Lots of books have been published called The New Cold War with Russia. Our own president, of course, on Twitter, talking about the new Cold War with Russia. And then a couple of years later, you saw a similar phenomenon with respect to China. And from my comparative vantage point, a lot of the same language. I just picked a few here, but you can see them where many people, and most certainly the Trump administration, are trying to reframe U.S.-China relations as the second Cold War. In fact, the Policy Planning Office of the State Department just released an 80-page document on U.S.-China relations, and they were trying to emulate and echo Kennan, who was the first director of policy planning, who basically designed our strategy of containment during the Cold War. And they very explicitly are trying to say, we are here again, and here's our strategy for dealing with communist China in this Cold War 2.0. And if you go back and you look at the first national security main document published by the Trump administration, one of the main authors of it, by the way, is my colleague here at Stanford at the Hoover Institution, H.R. McMaster, former national security advisor. They are very explicit, defining China and Russia as revisionist powers, and in this document say the central challenge for the 21st century is how to deal with these two countries. And so what I want to do today is first explain what happened, how did that happen? Then second, talk a little bit about both similarities but also differences that I see with the Cold War, because I think we need to get this right analytically if we're going to succeed in our foreign policy objectives in dealing with China and Russia. And then third, if I have time, and I'm going to watch the time closely because I really want to make sure we have enough time for questions, speculate a bit about what I think a new Biden administration should do and might do with respect to dealing with these challenges moving forward. So first, the why question. What happened? That photo on the left, of course, is Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in 1988, when we thought the end of the Cold War had happened. I think it ended formally for me in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And yet in both of these bilateral relationships with Russia and China, we're at a much more confrontational moment today than we were back in 1991. So I first want to answer what happened. And I want to focus on three factors that I think you have to bear in mind for explaining this new moment of confrontation. You just can't focus on any one of them. You have to focus on all three. First, power. There's been power shifts in the last 30 years. China has become significantly more powerful on many, many dimensions, military, economic, ideational, than they were 30 years ago. Russia also has become more powerful. I think there's a common misnomer in the way we talk about Russia that they never really recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they're a basket case, and Burkina Faso with nuclear weapons. Somebody wrote that once. That is just incorrect, everyone. That is the Russia of the 1990s. That is not the Russia of today. And with respect to economic power, of course, they're way behind China. But with respect to military power, in many dimensions, they're the second most powerful country in the world. And in one dimension, nuclear weapons, they are tied with us as the most powerful country in the world. And on cyber, I would say they rank above China in terms of their capacity. And also on the ideational part, they have much more capacity than they did 30 years ago. But then finally, in talking about the balance of power in the international system, I think it's accurate to say the United States has been in relative decrease compared to relative increase, especially of China over these last 30 years. We're still expanding, but we're not expanding at the same rate that China is. And so China is expanding faster, and we're raising up together, leaving behind most other states in the world. But relative to China, we are decreasing in power, measured again along many different dimensions. Second, regime type. I think it's not enough just to focus on power. I think regimes matter, ideas matter. And I think this is a source of our competition and confrontation with both Russia and China today. First, with China. They have had continuity in their regime. It's a Leninist one-party dictatorship. It has been since 1949. For a period of time before the Xi Jinping era, there were signs of relative, minor political liberalization in that system. And that was accompanying what I think is much more radical and more substantial liberalization with their market economy. And that, I think, is real. And that is different from the Marxist-Leninist Maoist regime that was set up 40 years ago. But having said that, I think there's more continuity than discontinuity. And in the Xi Jinping era, I would argue that China has become more autocratic, not less. That leads to confrontations with democratic countries in the world, first and foremost, us. Second, Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was trying to build a democracy under Boris Yeltsin, and we were trying to help them do that. Tragically, that project failed. And over the last 20 years, Mr. Putin has made Russia a much more autocratic system of government. And I think as a result of that, that has led to much more tensions between the United States and Russia. And then third, a much lesser factor compared to the other two, but I think it's also fair to say that over the last 30 years, relatively speaking, our democracy is not as robust. We are a democracy that has been failing by many different groups that rate this. If you're interested in looking at this material, I would recommend going to the Freedom House website and just look at the trend lines. And we just are not as robust as a democracy compared to where we were 30 years ago. And as a result, that has made it harder for us to be the leader of the free world. Third and final factor, leaders. In addition to power and in addition to regimes, I think that leaders matter. And in this case, three leaders in particular, I think have helped to exacerbate tensions between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. Xi Jinping, I already mentioned. I think many things he's done. Oh, let me go through these actually in opposite direction. Let me start with Putin. Most dramatically, I think individual things that Putin has done that were not dictated because of Russia's power and were not dictated because of Russia's political regime type, but were his decisions alone. And here's the main list of them, have exacerbated tensions between the United States and Russia. And I would argue, a different political leader in Russia who did not make these decisions, invading Ukraine, intervening in Syria, interfering in our elections in 2016, or trying to kill Mr. Skripal in Great Britain in 2018, a different leader choosing a different course would have put our bilateral relationship in a more stable, more cooperative place. Likewise with Xi, I think several things that he personally has done that were his decisions alone and were not dictated by Chinese power or Chinese Marxist-Leninist ideology have exacerbated tensions between the United States and China. And here's just a list of some of those most recently that have occurred. And then finally on leadership, we have our power in the United States and we have our democracy, but within those two factors, leadership also matters. And I think over the last 4 years, President Trump has had a particular set of ideas about the world, isolationist, realist, nationalist. And as a result of those things, we have done things to disengage from the world. I call it the Trump withdrawal doctrine. And as a result of that, that has created more tensions between us and the outside world than had we been more engaged in leading the international system. So that's on explanation. That's how we got here. Second question I want to wrestle with for 10 or 15 minutes. Is this really a new Cold War with China and Russia? And I'm sorry that it has to be complex. I'm sorry I don't have a simplistic answer to it. But I think it's a mix. Some things are similar and some things are different. And I think it's really dangerous to oversimplify, to just say we're just like our relationship with China is exactly like the Soviet Union, I think is incorrect and will lead to some very dangerous consequences for the United States. But to say there's nothing in common, I also think will lead to some dangerous consequences regarding American foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And I think the same thing with respect to Russia. And so let me now try to explain that. And I apologize for complexity, but I'm sorry, folks, the world is complex. And I think ignoring it, we do so at our peril. All right, let's start with the Soviet Union and Russia. And I'm not going to go through every single bullet point on this slide. I'll just let you read them and we can talk about them in questions. But maybe let me take two or three and I'll just turn this into kind of a good news, bad news, sing-song story. The good news about the end of the Cold War is that we are not in a quantitative nuclear arms race with Russia today. That ended with the Cold War. We used to have 30, 40, 50,000, depending on how you count them, nuclear weapons aimed at each other. Today, because of the New START Treaty, we're now down to 1,550. By the way, you can still blow up the world with 1,550 nuclear weapons. I shouldn't joke about it. We have a lot more work to do, but that's a better place to be than when we were at during the height of the Cold War. The bad news is that we have entered a qualitative arms race with Russia today. They're developing new delivery vehicles and new weapons that are not controlled under any arms control agreements. One that scares me in particular is called a Poseidon. It's a weapon that travels underwater for hundreds of miles. It's like a giant torpedo, and then it explodes a nuclear device off the coast of an enemy, and that causes giant flooding on the coast of an enemy. And just go look on a map one day and look where there's some shoreline of Russia, and look where there's some shoreline of America. It's where I live here in California. And this weapon is designed very explicitly to attack coastline country enemies like us. And another thing that's different about it, it's not designed to attack hard military targets. It's actually designed to kill people. So are we better off or worse off as a result of that? We could debate that. Number two, good news from the end of the Cold War. The ideological competition between communism and capitalism is over. I know there are some people in the Republican Party that want to bring it alive, and I know there's some people up in Berkeley that still believe there's a fight between communism and capitalism. I'm sorry for that joke. I'm a Stanford guy, and we just beat Berkeley in the big game last week. But I think this is over, and that's good that it's over, because it was very damaging to the entire globe, in my view. The bad news from our new situation with Russia is there's another ideological struggle to oversimplify. It's Putin's conservative nationalism against what he defines as decadent Western liberalism. And we're not even noticing it, but he is fighting this ideological struggle, investing billions of dollars propagating his ideas around the world, but especially in Europe and the United States. And I want to admit to you that I think he's had some success. He has allies, Mr. Orban in Hungary, Le Pen in France, Salvini in Italy, Nigel Farage in the UK, and some allies within the Republican Party, or extreme elements maybe beyond the Republican Party here in the United States of America. That's new. And I'm not sure we're actually winning that ideological struggle right now. And then finally, the good news from the end of the Cold War is we are not fighting proxy wars all over the world. The Cold War wasn't cold, actually. We fought it all over the place. By some estimates, 120 million people died during the so-called peaceful times, stable times of the Cold War. Thankfully, with a few pockets of exception in Syria and maybe in Libya, we're not doing that today. The bad news is that there are new instruments of competition that in some ways are more disturbing to me. Annexation, for instance. We didn't do annexation during the Cold War. It's back now with Putin's annexation of Crimea. Sanctions. We have more Russians on our sanctions list today than at any time during the Cold War. And likewise, the Russian government has more sanctions on Americans than at any time during the Cold War. I know, because I'm one of them. I cannot travel to Russia today as a result of this confrontation we're in, because I'm on their sanctions list. And then finally, these cyber weapons, where they are infiltrating and attacking us within our country, and we have these capabilities as well. That's a new dimension of competition that we didn't have during the Cold War. So better off or worse off, it's kind of a mixed bag, I would say. I'll skip that for now and go to China. Similarities and differences between us and the Chinese with the Cold War. First, there are some real similarities, and I think it's wrong to ignore them. As I already intimated, I think there are two global superpowers in the world. It's not a multipolar world, and my prediction is by the end of this century, that will be even more acutely so. That's like the Soviet Union. That's like the 20th century. Second, the global competition between our two countries takes place in many dimensions: economic, trade, investment, and it is global. It is not just regionally focused in Asia. That's something that we also did with the Soviets, competing with them in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa. This was a global competition. Third, and this is most controversial, I think, not everybody agrees with this, but I believe that there is an ideological competition between the United States and China. They are promoting a form of autocracy. We support democracy. We have a model of economic development that's based on market economics. Theirs is a more state-led development model. And that ideological competition creates tensions. And to underscore, like I said, with power, they're not just promoting their ideas within their country, and we are not just promoting our ideas within our country. We both have global aspirations to promote our competing ideas, and that creates tensions. And then finally, my prediction, like the Cold War, this competition with China will last for decades. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And at the same time, right, this is complex, I think there are also some very important differences that we have to think about as we try to model and think about our new approach for how to deal with China in the Biden administration, and I would say for coming decades. And again, this is a complex slide we could spend the entire rest of my talk on. But let me just highlight 2 or 3 that I think are important. One, we are the 2 unquestioned superpowers, yes, but there's still an asymmetry there. We still have a lot more military power. That's a good thing. We are ahead of the Chinese so far. That's a good thing, in my opinion. Second, I said there's an ideological contest. That's true, but it is not as intense as the ideological contest that we had with the Soviet Union. And I strongly disagree with the Trump administration when they argue that China is seeking to export Marxism, Leninism, and communism throughout the world. I just do not see that they have that game plan. They want to export their system of development, and they want to have influence around the world, but they are not overthrowing regimes and putting in place Marxist-Leninist regimes. I can't think of a single case like that. That happened all the time during the Cold War. And if they are trying to propagate Marxist-Leninist ideas, they're doing a really bad job at it. There are very few countries where you could say that those ideas have been growing in popularity over the last 10 or 20 years. And then finally, on the economic piece, let me say 2 more points on this slide. On the economic piece, I think it's important to point out that yes, China is the largest economy in the world, or at least close to us, depending on which measure you use, and that's real. But when you look at GDP per capita, China is way behind us. We're in the top 10 or 15, depending on how you count it. China is hovering around 50 or 45. They are a middle income country, not a rich country. And it is really difficult, we know historically, to go from a middle income country to a high income country. And when countries attempt to do that, that's oftentimes when there's a lot of political drama in those countries. And so I think this notion that China is just going to keep marching forward and becoming richer and richer and richer and then overtake the world with their economy, I want to suggest that there's a lot more uncertainty about that trajectory, especially if you look at other countries that tried to do the same. That's the good news. The bad news is on, and I'll end with this with the China comparison, on the retrenching piece. We, during the Cold War, never wavered from the idea that the United States was the leader of the liberal international order or the free world. There were periods of retrenchment. There were periods that we engaged in that more robustly. Most certainly at the end of the 60s and, our withdrawal from Vietnam and coupled with lots of dramas we were having domestically here, first with civil rights and then later with um, um, resignation of President Nixon, that was a period of retrenchment where people were arguing, just like they are today in our country, we got to get our own house in order, and why are we involved in other people's wars abroad? So there were moments like that during the Cold War for sure. But I'm struck by the intensity of this retrenchment idea that you've seen most dramatically with President Trump and with those that support him in the Republican Party, more radical isolationists than we've had at any time since the interwar period in our country. But I want to also point out that isolationist tendencies are also rather robust in the Democratic Party right now. And I fear that these can come together and that we may think that it's better to be disengaged in the world in dealing with China. And my own prediction from that is that will lead to negative consequences for American security and American prosperity. I'll skip that one too. To conclude, I think I'm just going to wrap up here in a couple of minutes and not go through this entire slide deck because I want to get to your questions. If you take what I just said, similarities and differences, and summarize what I think versus what I think is conventional wisdom about these debates, I want to highlight what I think are some big misperceptions in the American debate about China and Russia today. And to oversimplify, I think we sometimes are overestimating the China threat and underestimating the Russia threat. So on the China side, I think we're overestimating China power because we are presuming that they're just going to keep marching along the way they are now. And I just would suggest that maybe that'll be true or maybe it won't. And if you're interested in that, I highly recommend going back and reading some of the literature in the 70s, when many people were arguing exactly the same thing about the Soviet Union and that they were going to overtake the world and that their power was growing. That turned out to be a very premature prediction. And second, as I've already talked about, I think we're overestimating their commitment to exporting Marxism, Leninism, and dictatorship. And third, I think we're underestimating the costs of decoupling and trying to contain China everywhere around the world. I just think pursuing that might lead us to some of the disastrous things we did during the Cold War. I'll end with that in a minute. And on Russia, as I've hinted, I think we're underestimating the ideological appeal of Putinism. We are underestimating him as a leader willing to use whatever power he has. Who would have predicted that he would invade Ukraine or try to disrupt our elections in 2016. And as I've noted, I think we sometimes underestimate their power capacities. Let me just end on this. Lessons from the Cold War to avoid today and lessons from the Cold War to emulate. Three quickly here that follow from what I just said about compare and contrast. We need to be very careful about misperceptions of the threat. When I look back at the Cold War, some of our biggest mistakes was about overestimating threats and over-responding to them. We thought we had a missile gap with the Soviets, so we spent trillions of dollars building tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that we didn't need. That was a mistake. We thought that everybody who had an inkling about socialist ideas was a communist. We went on a witch hunt during the 50s, McCarthyism. That was tremendously damaging to our country. And we are tiptoeing towards doing that with respect to China today. And the biggest mistake we made, in my view, we conflated nationalism and communism, and this notion that if we lose the battle for communism in Vietnam, we're going to have communism in California. Huge mistake, very costly mistake. I see us tiptoeing towards that mistake with respect to China again right now. I hope we will learn those lessons and not repeat them again. Second, overreach related to threat misperceptions. We sometimes thought that we had to support the fight against communism everywhere. We supported freedom fighters in Angola, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and over time, there were some very negative things that happened about that. And again, I would highly encourage you, if you're really interested in this subject, to go back and look at the debates that they had between Kennan and others, Dean Acheson in particular. And that is a debate that Ambassador Kennan, our former ambassador to Moscow, by the way, something I share with him. Well, one other thing I share with him, by the way, he and I are the only two former ambassadors to Moscow to have been banned from the Soviet Union and Russia. So we share that common heritage, that common background. But Kennan lost this debate. Kennan called for a more constrained containment. Those that thought we had to contain communism everywhere won out, and that led to, I think, some bad consequences for the United States. And then third, and we see this really with this debate on China in particular, but I would argue even with the debate on Russia, believing that because these battles are so big, we should embrace anybody who's on our side. That led us to embracing the apartheid regime in South Africa, the Shah in Iran, Pinochet in Chile. And in retrospect, we didn't need those allies to win the Cold War. And when I see a year ago that Secretary Pompeo went to meet with the dictator of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, and I see today that we talk about the communists in Vietnam as somehow liberalizing because they are helping us in how we're dealing with China, I think we need to be careful and cautious about jumping into bed again with dictators just because they say the right things vis-a-vis our enemies. But then finally, let me end on this. There are some good things to learn from the Cold War as well. And let me just talk about two big buckets. Number two, we did contain the Soviet Union and cooperate with the Soviet Union simultaneously. I think we can do that again, vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis Russia. During the height of the Cold War, we cooperated with the Soviets on smallpox eradication, non-proliferation, arms control. In space, you may recall, we cooperated in space. I think that is a smart model for how to deal with both China and Russia moving forward. And second, we developed mechanisms to reduce misperceptions and misunderstandings so that we didn't stumble into open confrontation with the Soviets. This all happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we came very close to stumbling into a nuclear war with the Soviets. And rightfully so, more pragmatic individuals in both Moscow and Washington set up these mechanisms so that we just made sure we understood each other. And when I look at our relationship with both China and Russia today, I see a lot of misperception. I see a lot of misunderstandings because we're just not talking to each other. And, you know, I used to always say this as ambassador in Moscow. We're going to have disagreements with Mr. Putin. And some of those disagreements are going to be so deep that no amount of talking to him, no amount of démarches, no amount of track two dialogues is going to change that. But we cannot have disagreements, let alone confrontation, based on misunderstanding and misperceptions. And that is the role of diplomats, to make sure that we don't have those. In many ways, I think diplomacy with our competitors is way more important than diplomacy with our allies and our partners. And so I think those are really important lessons moving forward. And I could talk about Biden and the moment we're in now, and this Biden agenda that I think flows naturally from what I just described there. But why don't I just let you read that document and take some questions now. Thank you for being so patient, especially as we talk virtually here on Zoom.
Thank you very much for your comments. Very enlightening. And I must say that it's generated a lot of questions in our question and answer.
Excellent. Good.
So I'm going to read a few to you, and you can do your best to answer them. So a couple of our attendees have asked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And could you share any update or information you have? And how might this affect the relationship between the United States and Russia?
Well, the first thing I want to do, because it's the last slide that I decided to skip, as we enter the holiday era, and you have friends that like to read about history, or maybe you have a grandfather or a niece or a nephew that you want to get them interested in history, and you're especially interested in this question, go buy my book. It's called From Cold War to Hot Peace, U.S. Ambassadors in Putin's Russia. And I joke, but I want you to buy my book. I put a lot of work in that book. I wrote it in a way that anybody can read it. You don't have to have a PhD in political science to read it. And it jumps from very serious substantive issues about negotiating the arms control agreement that we did, the New START Treaty, to how the two-step, because my father's a country western musician, was instrumental in the public diplomacy that I did personally while the U.S. ambassador to Russia. So, go get that book, because I have a whole chapter devoted to Ukraine. But now let me answer the question. So to remind everybody, I don't want to assume everybody's followed this history. There were popular demonstrations in Ukraine in the fall of 2013 and in the winter of 2014, protesting against President Yanukovych at the time's decision to not move towards joining the European Union. Eventually, those protests turned bloody. 100 people died. We tried to defuse it, just so you know. By the way, our point person for trying to defuse it was Vice President Biden. He was the person on the phone with Yanukovych and the opposition to try to cut a deal so that they could avoid a major confrontation. We thought we had a deal in February 2014. It fell apart. Yanukovych fled, the Ukrainian president. He went to Russia. The revolutionaries took over, and Putin was extremely upset about that. And that's when he decided to annex Crimea. And when that proved to be pretty easy to do, that's when he upped the ante, and he's decided to help, but including with military intervention, the insurgent forces in eastern Ukraine, who also were calling for independence for eastern Ukraine in a move similar to what happened in Crimea. And as a result of that, that's when President Obama, together with our allies, Angela Merkel played a very crucial role in this. That's when we pushed back. That's when we put in sanctions against many Russian governments and individuals. That's when we strengthened NATO and making huge new investments in NATO and moving NATO troops closer to the Russian border. And that's when we began to give greater military, political, and economic assistance to Ukraine. And to make a long story short, it's been basically frozen ever since. Putin never left Crimea, of course. He's still there. It's now considered a region of Russia from his point of view. The insurgents, rebels, these words are highly charged in these debates. So I'm not making a normative statement by calling them that. Terrorists is another word that some people use. But those who are entrenched in Donbass, the eastern Ukrainian region that is trying to break away, they're basically there. To this day, Putin supports them, and there's been no successful negotiation to the end of that conflict. Very tragically, because it's been, it's a low-level war today, but most certainly the people of that region are suffering. 2 million of them have had to flee. And the Trump administration didn't achieve, did not make any success in trying to reach some kind of agreement there. It's interesting to watch what might happen with the new Biden administration, because Vice President Biden spent a lot of time on Ukraine in the Obama administration. He's been there 6 or 7 times. I traveled there with him in September of 2009. There's never been a president generally more experienced with respect to foreign policy on day one than President-elect Biden. Maybe George H.W. Bush, he obviously also was very qualified. But I actually think the more I think now, as I think about it, Biden has had 40 years of experience. That's even more than H.W. Bush. And with respect to this part of the world, we've never had a president that knows this part of the world better. And that is fueling some optimism in Ukraine that the United States might become more engaged to help solve this standoff, at least in eastern part of Ukraine. I think Crimea will be a lot more difficult, but I think it's too early to tell just yet.
And that actually has been a couple of the questions that we've gotten. I know you hinted at the end of your slides, but maybe you could just talk a little bit more about what do you predict the relationship the United States will have, not just with Russia, but with China under a Biden-Harris administration and even into the future?
So in my academic world, when we try to describe presidents' views, it's a giant oversimplification because that's what you're supposed to do as an academic, right? Take really complex things and oversimplify. But I at least, I don't want to speak for all of academia. Let me just speak for myself. When I try to teach this, and I teach a course on American foreign policy, I have a 2x2 matrix. I might boot up some slides and show you, but there's two dimensions. On the one dimension, there's internationalists versus isolationists. And on the other dimension, there's what we call realists versus Wilsonian liberals. Internationalist, isolationist, I think that's pretty clear. This other dimension is, do you just talk about security interests, or do presidents also talk about values and care about what happens within states? In that 2x2 matrix, one other thing I want to say, if you don't remember anything else from my talk, if you do a 2x2 matrix, when I draw that, there's Democrats and Republicans in all four of those quadrants. I think the biggest misconception that people, at least abroad, have is that Democrats and Republicans, there's a Democratic foreign policy and Republican. There's not. There's isolationist Democrats, isolationist Republicans, internationalist Republicans, internationalist Democrats, realist Democrats, realist Republicans, and Wilsonian liberal Democrats and Wilsonian liberal Republicans. Sometimes they're called neocons. The most important Wilsonian liberal in the 20th century, by the way, was Ronald Reagan. The most important realist in the 20th century was President Nixon, just to make sure we understand this is not a debate between Democrats and Republicans. All right, that said, in that mapping, Trump would be way up there in the corner of an isolationist and a realist. He withdrew from a lot of things. He didn't think it was in our interest to be engaged in the world or trapped by treaties, as he would call them. That's where he was on that first dimension. And on the other dimension, he also was a realist. He just did not put a lot of attention to talking about democracy and human rights, universal values, with a couple of exceptions in a couple of countries. But on both dimensions, he was way over here in this corner. And I'm watching my hands here. Biden is quite dramatically in the exact opposite corner, which is to say he is quite dramatically an internationalist. And you're going to see that debate with Republicans, but also within the Democratic Party. Just as a data point, Congressman Ro Khanna from California was just on, what is her show called? The Laura Ingraham show 2 nights ago, talking, they weren't talking in this academic language I was, but Ro Khanna, a Democrat, was talking to Laura, a quite conservative commentator, exactly about these things because they tend to be on the more isolationist side of that debate. And also on this values part, Biden has made clear he wants to have values be part of his diplomacy. And he's already said that he plans in the first year of his administration to have a conference on democracy, a global conference on democracy. So on those two dimensions, very different approach, generally speaking, to the entire world. And that has big implications for both China and Russia. You're going to see more talk about values with respect to China and Russia. But I also think you're going to see more talk about engaging on things that we can cooperate on. This mix of containment and engagement. Again, I can't predict it, but I do know the president-elect pretty well. I know his pick for Secretary of State and National Security Advisor are good friends of mine. And I think that's the way they're going to try to frame things. More talk about values, contain as well, and also cooperate in a limited area where we share common interests.
Thank you. I guess to follow on with that, in terms of how you classify the administrations and where they are, the role that you think the future administration might play in human rights abuses in China and in Russia, mostly the Uyghurs in China, the LGBT concentration camps in one part of Russia. From a realist point of view, maybe you just don't look at that. How do you think it's going to be in the future?
Well, I do think President Biden and the Biden administration will give a lot more attention to these issues than the Trump administration did, and more consistently, right? The Trump administration, and let me even qualify this even more. You need to distinguish between Trump and the Trump administration in a way that I've never witnessed in American history that I've studied before. You had a big disconnect on a lot of foreign policy issues between what the president wanted to do and his own administration. And when it came to issues like in Russia, President Trump wanted to befriend Putin. He made that very clear as candidate, and he was very consistent on that for 4 years. I think that's fair to say that. His administration had a different view that they didn't want to befriend Putin. And so you had a lot of tension and a lot of mixed messaging along those set of issues. President Trump never once talked about democracy and human rights in Russia. He never once met with a human rights activist from Russia, to the best of my knowledge. That's a departure from what Obama did. Obama, in his first trip to Russia, 2009, I was there, met with President Medvedev, met with Prime Minister Putin, but then also met with human rights activists and opposition activists, including LGBT activists, by the way, because we had a policy of dual track engagement, engage with the government and society. And I fully expect that President Biden will go back to that philosophy. He will not check his values at the door in speaking to President Putin in a meeting with the government. And likewise, he won't ignore human rights activists when he's in the country of Russia. I think he'll do that kind of dual track, just like President Obama did. In fact, when we were there in 2011, that's exactly what we did with the vice president. We drove, I remember it really clearly, we drove from Prime Minister Putin's office to the ambassador's residence, it's called Spaso House, and we met with the political opposition. And Mr. Biden at the time was very comfortable doing that. He was not nervous about it at all. That's at the top level. The hard part to whoever asked the questions, because it's in many ways, I think it's one of the hardest questions in diplomacy, period. How do you do more than just symbolic things? How do you actually make the lives of LGBT activists or Uyghur activists in Russia and China better? That's a harder question. And, sometimes we think that just putting out a statement, that's the easy thing to do. I wrote 100 of those statements when I worked at the White House and when I was ambassador. And that makes you feel good. I said something about this horrible thing that happened, and maybe it makes other people feel good, but it's also kind of ephemeral, right? It's a one-day news cycle thing. What happens later? And I'm involved, in the margins with the Biden folks on this. I want us to be more systematic about how we try to do more than just these symbolic things. And that means getting smarter about global communications. I think we're just way behind the Chinese and the Russians right now on that. I think it means rethinking how we support democracy abroad. I think some of the models and mechanisms we have are outdated. And I hope that the Biden administration might use that summit that they've put on the books as a kind of action forcing event to compel the US government to rethink how they're doing this stuff, and also then to compel our democratic allies for how we can do this kind of work together more systematically. Just as a small point, what's a good example? When there was the arrest of a band in Russia, the band is called Pussy Riot. They went to jail, and I bravely said those two words together, by the way. I wasn't brave enough to say them when I was the U.S. ambassador. That's the title of their band. I didn't choose the title. I'm just quoting their title. They did a concert in a church, and they were arrested. They went to jail. One, for what we thought were unusually draconian sentences. And when I was one of the first ambassadors to criticize that, it's always better if we did that all together, if we all did it with the EU ambassadors from all the democratic countries together. So one, figure out what we're going to do in this agenda in terms of our own policy, and then two, do it with our allies. And then just three, I should have mentioned it first. We got to get our own act together at home. We have no credibility telling other countries what they should do vis-a-vis democratic reforms if we're not more serious about improving our own democratic system of government here in the United States.
Thank you. Another question from a student's point of view. So with someone doing their homework, they say, while in school, you studied abroad in what was then the Soviet Union several times. How did that impact your understanding of the world and your decisions about future career paths? And what would you say to students today about engaging in that kind of education abroad experience?
Well, first, I'm thrilled that we have some students on. These are hard times for students. I teach at Stanford. I have a son in college. I have a son in high school. And to all you students out there, I just deeply admire you for engaging. We're almost done. And to all those of you who teach out there, thank you for that service too. It's hard stuff. For me, I don't want to be too dramatic here, but going abroad and studying abroad for the first time, as I did in 1983, to the Soviet Union, to Leningrad State University to study Russian, completely changed my entire life and my career trajectory. I would have been a very different person without that summer. I grew up in Montana. I came to Stanford as a young kid, 17-year-old kid. I'd never been to California, by the way. When I did that, I'd never been abroad before I came to California. And back then, this is 1981, we had a new president, Ronald Reagan, and he was saying some pretty scary things, I thought, about the Cold War and the evil empire and the Soviet Union. And my initial interest in this, I really want to give credit to my high school. I went to Bozeman Senior High School, and I was on the debate team there. And my initial interest in the Soviet Union came from that experience. So shout out to high school teachers who take rough people like me and help make us think about things outside of just our small worlds. And I most certainly had that experience. Adam Roberts, I want to give him, he's since passed away, but Mr. Roberts had a big impact on me. Adam Roberts was my advisor at Oxford. I'm mixing up their names. But so that sparked it. And then I got to California, I got to Stanford, And fall quarter of my freshman year, I enrolled in 2 courses that was the predicate to this trip. One was called How Nations Deal with Each Other. So a talk, not unlike the one I just gave, was one that really opened up my mind. And that's when I learned about realism and liberalism for the first time. And here I am, folks, talking to you about it. So that professor also had a huge analytic impact on me. But the second course I took was first year Russian, fall quarter of my freshman year, because I had a hypothesis, I had an idea that, maybe Ronald Reagan didn't understand the Soviet Union. Maybe he was also overstating the threat, right? Think about some of the things I talked about earlier. And if we could just get to know the Soviets a little better, maybe we could just bring down some of the tensions between our 2 countries. That was my idea. Very simple idea. And after 2 years of studying Russian, I decided I had to go test my hypothesis. And that's how I figured out to get on this program. By the way, there weren't very many Americans who studied in the Soviet Union in 1983. And I also just want you to just think about, especially for those who have children these days in college, that phone call to my mom, my mom in Montana, who, by the way, thought that California was a communist place back then. And then I grew my hair long, and she thought I was becoming a socialist. And then I called up my mom and said, "Hey, Mom, I want to go to the evil empire and study because I want to, reduce tensions with these communist enemies." That was a hard phone call for her, but bless her heart, she's been very supportive of me. But it did change my views in 2 different ways, by the way. One that might be intuitive, one counterintuitive. The intuitive way, I learned from that trip that we had a lot more in common with people in the Soviet Union than I had learned without ever having been there. Turned out college kids just like me, living in Leningrad in the summer of 1983, they loved Led Zeppelin. So did I. They weren't so different in terms of their aspirations about what they wanted in their lives and my lives. And, the role of communism versus capitalism and, this kind of Cold War stuff was not central to their lives at the time. And that was really revealing. And I still believe that to this day. Russians have way more in common with Americans than our differences. The second thing I also learned, however, is that regimes that propagate their ideologies are troublesome for those that believe in free societies. And I came to appreciate the ideological dimension of our tensions through that experience and other experiences. But the biggest thing is just, it's just you can study all you want, sitting at Stanford or Montana someplace, but the first day in Leningrad had a bigger impact on my study of the Soviet Union than my entire 2 years of studying the Soviet Union at Stanford University. I literally think I learned more in that first day than everything I'd learned in the classroom. So to those of you who want to learn about the world, I cannot recommend more highly. Do what you can to get yourself ready. It doesn't do any good if you don't know anything. And most certainly if you know some of the language, that'll help you have a more meaningful experience. But from my personal experience, and I've studied, abroad and lived abroad in many places, right? Poland, Zimbabwe, England, just to name a few. It's transformational. I could not encourage you enough. And thank you, Kathleen, for letting me go on so long on that, because you can see that it's something I feel very passionate about.
Thank you very much. I think it's something that a lot of us who've had that same experience feel very passionate about. So I think it's reassuring for students to hear that that is something worthwhile to pursue. And with that, we are out of time. And unfortunately, because we had a whole lot of audience questions that we did not get to, but we got to a lot of them. And I really appreciate you spending the time with us this afternoon. And I appreciate all of you who came to listen to our presentation today. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Keep in touch on Twitter. You can follow me there at McFaul. I'll try to answer questions I didn't get to, okay?
Good suggestion. Thank you.
All right. See you all later. Bye-bye.